One thing I wanted to talk to you about, Gavin, is these dystopian times we're living in. These dystopian times that we've been living in. They've released a lot of dystopian Stephen King content. Obviously, Gavin and I both went and saw The Long Walk a few months ago. We talked about that a little bit on stream, but just last night, we saw the long awaited, at least long awaited for me. It had been 4 years since Edgar Wright had dropped a film with Last Night in Soho, divisive film. I liked it. Gavin did not appreciate the last half of the film, to say the least. But we were both really excited to go see his contribution in 2025, a remake of The Running Man.
Which, as you said, came out, I guess, coincidentally, the exact same year, just a few months after the adaptation of Stephen King's The Long Walk, which we saw in theaters. That starred Philip Seymour Hoffman's son, Cooper Hoffman. And I had very mixed feelings on that film. I was pretty disappointed by it. And I was also, unfortunately, pretty disappointed by The Running Man, directed by Edgar Wright. The weird thing is how similar these two stories are. I haven't actually read either book. I'm not a huge Stephen King head. I definitely respect the man, but I just haven't done a deep dive as far as his actual work goes. The crazy thing is, again, these movies came out the same year, The Long Walk, The Running Man. They both have really similar plots. They both take place in a, dystopian, not so distant future, right? Where there's like a big televised contest. And if you're deep in poverty, you can participate in this horrible, reality TV style contest to, uplift yourself into a higher social strata to, save your family. In The Long Walk, the main character's, trying to help his mom. And The Running Man, the main character's trying to help his wife and sick child, right? So they decide to participate in this televised sort of dystopian contest to, dig their way out of the shit, right? And get some money. Weirdly, I think that both of these movies came out far too late. Obviously, there is already a film based on The Running Man starring Arnold Schwarzenegger from back in the day. But my take on both The Long Walk and The Running Man is that way too many movies have come out in the last 10, 30 years that are clearly in some way inspired by these stories. Like, I can tell that the Stephen King source material was really inspirational to a lot of fiction and screenwriting in the last 20 or so years. But because of that, by the time we now actually get adaptations of The Running Man and The Long Walk, to me at least, they both felt downright derivative. It felt like, oh, we've seen this before literally 100 times. And specifically in the case of The Running Man, it really broke my heart because I like Edgar Wright. I just don't think he did nearly enough to kind of change the perspective of the story or the feeling of the world that he created here to actually differentiate it from all of those other clones out there and all of these other stories that have obviously taken direct inspiration from this sort of a story. Obviously, The Hunger Games being a big one, Squid Game, The Purge. There's so many movies that this feels reminiscent of. And again, in this case specifically with The Running Man, I just didn't feel like it did enough to separate itself from all of those other stories, all of those other movies, which it just constantly feels downright derivative of.
Yeah, it felt cheap, right? It felt very artificial, and I agree it feels derivative. Now, it's kind of weird saying that about a guy like Edgar Wright because often his films are references or steeped with references, almost like a pastiche of his favorite films. If you look at a film like Shaun of the Dead, obviously it's a parody of a zombie film. Hot Fuzz, that was the entire premise of the Cornetto trilogy or Cornetto trilogy. What was it called? Yeah, either way, long story short, he does that often and he typically does that well, but I felt like it's very contrived and it's very slopped together. Obviously, it feels like a lazy criticism at this point already to say that a film feels like it was written by ChatGPT, but I felt like the opening act of this film was really low-level dialogue. It was very rushed in terms of exposition. They couldn't wait to get to the actual running game, and I don't want to get into any spoilers, but they did not do a sufficient job, and I think either of our view, of really developing the family unit that Glenn Powell's character was supposedly risking it all to stand up for, given the fact that it's very choppy at the beginning of the film and the dialogue is a little unbelievable and far-fetched.
Oh yeah, 100%, 100%. You can tell that Edgar Wright only directed this and did not write the script. This is clearly based on an adaptation that was kind of cobbled together by Hollywood hacks, from what I can tell. I'm not actually sure who wrote this thing, but it's definitely not Edgar Wright. So at times you get some of that Edgar Wright flair, right? Some of that, charismatic style that you associate with Edgar Wright. But yeah, the script is a complete disservice to his actual powers as a filmmaker because it is so goddamn generic, from the dialogue to the character building. And you're 100% right. In that first like 10 minutes or so, they just rush through so much exposition. You're asked to care about characters that really never truly get revisited, but are supposed to be the whole emotional core of the narrative and of the main character's motivation, who's obviously played by Glenn Powell. Glenn Powell is a charming, charismatic, extremely handsome guy, kind of a modern day Tom Cruise or Brad Pitt, maybe. But unfortunately, I felt that in this film, his character was just too generic. It was like watching a fucking action figure, go through this movie, not a real person. And this cliche of, oh, all I care about is my wife and my kid, that he keeps repeating. It really kind of drains any other interesting potential motivation from what could have been an interesting kind of moral quandary at various parts of the story. It really reduces any of that nuance, again, down to a cliche, which is repeated so often that it just gets kind of sickening, specifically because you don't even actually get to know or care about this wife and kid in question. It's very generic again. And there's a potential here, I think, for this film to go in interesting ways with a maybe darker character, a character that's a little bit more willing to compromise his morality. I actually felt the same way about The Long Walk, which we don't have to get into. But I felt that, the kind of person that would actually participate in such a challenge probably wouldn't be so wholesome, right? There would be darker instincts to get into and explore in an interesting way that just doesn't happen here. Again, this is just generic action figure man hero going through this challenge, and it really strips it of any sort of relatability in this attempt to make it so broad that it is relatable, right? So I had a huge issue with that. Again, considering that Edgar Wright, despite his faults, does usually know how to put together a pretty interesting, or at least charismatic, main character that you can invest in and relate to throughout the film. I never was able to grasp on too much with this Glenn Powell character, nor the people in the movie surrounding him. I thought that Josh Brolin as the villain was totally generic and forgettable and did not play to Brolin's real strengths as an actor either. So yeah, over and over again, I was disappointed by this movie. I don't want to get too far into spoiler territory, but what do you have to say about that?
Yeah, I agree with a lot of the points that you're making. I think that this film would have been a lot stronger had they gone into that more, dark kind of, I don't know, pathology that, yeah, you would have to be in a really dark place. You would have to be really struggling. And I think that there's a lot of there, right? Obviously, ever since Parasite blew up and it became like a global phenomenon, studios have decided to come around on, okay, well, we know we're all greedy bastards and we know we're living way nicer than everybody else is and people are suffering. I guess maybe we'll decide to commodify and corporatize that too. And this felt like the bland, Krispy Kreme donut impersonation of what a real dystopian film with teeth would feel like, because they don't develop the Glenn Powell character into somebody that is relatable, that is complicated, that has some faults, but is redemptive. And the other two people that are contestants on this competition, the Running Man, they're both they're just total thin, flattened characters. They're literally just stand-ins for like the most unoriginal kind of people in Hollywood, like the dopey guy that's just trying to get some pussy, and then the person that's all in love with like gluttony and just exist, like just complete hedonism, just going out with a bang. And they don't even make those characters interesting. And it really, again, just disappointing to see this from Edgar Wright, because I found what a lot of what I was able to forgive about The Long Walk that I don't think Gavin, really felt the need to forgive, was because I felt like it was a charming story for like children. And I was like, oh, if I was 14, I would really love this. And I just imagined myself in that like cinematic, romantic way of like being 14 again and seeing that movie and being like, wow, I would have loved this if I was 14. So it made me feel all fuzzy, and I gave it a more positive review than maybe I would have if it didn't make me feel that way. This movie didn't make me feel that way at all. I kept thinking like, man, you had the budget to do something cool. I know Edgar Wright has the vision to do something cool. And Gavin, I don't want to steal any thunder from this observation, but you said it to me earlier and I've been waiting for you to bring it up and you haven't yet. One film he just made that I enjoyed, but it was not a crowd pleaser, was Last Night in Soho. But it did seem like a much more original, much more personal film. And you had an observation about why maybe he followed it up with this film.
Yeah, well, Last Night in Soho came out probably 3 or 4 years ago. I believe that was his last.
2021.
Yeah, 2021. That was his last film before this one, and that one was an ambitious swing for the fences. I had mixed feelings on it. I really liked the first half, totally let down by the second half, and that film was a pretty big flop, not just at the box office, but it also earned him some of his first seriously mixed reviews as a filmmaker who's mostly enjoyed acclaim up until that point. I do kind of get the vibe with The Running Man that after he was rejected with Last Night in Soho, not only by the box office but by the critics, that he was kind of like, well, whatever. I guess, I spilled my soul. I went all out. You didn't like it. Well, now I'm just going to sell out and attach myself to this IP thing or this, big budget blockbuster movie, which it's not even going to succeed at being because the box office returns are already pretty disappointing from what I understand. But yeah, it does kind of feel like that, a retreat, right? You swing for the fences, you get rejected. Okay, I guess I'll just be a sellout. And that's the vibe I got with this movie. I know I'm sounding really harsh on it. I know we're sounding both really harsh on it. It's not a terrible film. It's a perfectly enjoyable movie. It's fun. It's not the most boring or tedious thing ever, but it does feel like a serious step down artistically for Edgar Wright, not just as a director, but also as a stylist and as a visual artist. Because Edgar Wright, I've never been the biggest fan of Edgar Wright, but his films do have a trademark visual aesthetic. He knows how to put the sparkle and the spice and really make a charismatic visual statement. To me, this felt downright cheap in a lot of scenes and in a lot of ways. And frankly, I don't even think that Edgar Wright was the correct director to do this. As someone points out, there's some major Escape from New York vibes in this film, specifically in the first half. You can tell he's really inspired by John Carpenter, specifically Escape from New York, but also They Live. But not only in a visual sense is this film way too glossy, right? It never gets as dirty or as dingy as those Carpenter movies like Escape from New York. It always feels like a glossy
kind of Netflixy.
Yeah, Netflix style like recreation of an aesthetic like that. So not only does it feel way too glossy in that way, but I also think that philosophically and politically, this film just misses almost every opportunity that comes its way to actually say something interesting in a way that a movie like They Live totally succeeds at, because this movie wants desperately to be like this smart social satire with political commentary and like a great science fiction story should have, right? But at almost every opportunity it seems to like depose of that fucking responsibility and take a more generic alternative where the main character kind of swears off a political ideology, and only at the very end is he kind of embraced as like a revolutionary figure. Not to spoil anything, but the movie kind of tries to insert this like ham-fisted revolutionary message in towards the end while never actually committing to it from the main character's perspective whatsoever. And instead of handling that in like an intelligent, nuanced, or interesting way, they could actually say something clever about the role that the common man finds himself in the proletariat. Instead of saying anything interesting, again, it comes off as extremely generic and extremely cowardly in a way that, again, just frustrates me based on how much inspiration it's taking from science fiction films and stories, which actually are a little bit more specific and ballsy. That being said, I will say the one thing I did appreciate about this film in comparison to The Long Walk is that I do appreciate that it actually modernized the story and updated it for our current dystopian times.
Well, it's supposed to be set in 2025, yeah.
Right. But I'm saying that The Long Walk, in my opinion, I think it would have been more interesting if they had updated it to the modern era. In this film, yes, it clearly is supposed to take place in the reality that's not that far off from where we're at right now, with the AI stuff, with the deep fake technology factoring in at several points. I thought that was some of the only really interesting stuff in the film, where they explored some of that technology like AI and deep fake stuff in a way that, again, felt a little bit sure. It unfortunately did feel reminiscent of Superman from earlier this year, James Gunn's Superman, how they kind of deep faked Superman at one point. So it felt a little bit done, but still fresher than some of the other stuff that I saw, like, for example, in The Long Walk, which to me just felt like a total retread of shit I've seen already. This one at least had that angle. But even then, I don't think it really said anything truly thought-provoking or original about AI or deepfakes. It just kind of incorporated it into the story.
Oh yeah, I completely agree, and that's what I was getting at with the whole Krispy Kreme donut analogy, right? Because it wants to be a film with a lot of meat on the bones, right? It wants to be something that you can sink your teeth into. It wants to have all of those bold ideas, but it's so corporate, right? It's kind of like when a record company hears this like, underground punk rock angry group and they're like pointing at another guy and they're like, do that, but don't make it too political. Like keep the angry anti-establishment stuff, but don't reference anything specific, right? Like don't talk about apartheid. Don't talk about, brutal cops. Like don't talk about anything but talk about the man. Talk about the establishment and how we're against the system. Words like the man in the system we love. Specifics about politics we don't love, right? And if you compare it to other films of the year that were from, dare I say, more sophisticated filmmakers in their output, at least if you're comparing their films in 2025, PTA, Ari Aster, Yorgos Lanthimos, all of which were grappling with these similar ideas. What are these dystopian times? And this was by far the most shallow. This was by far the least sophisticated. And it's crazy because Edgar Wright is a very sharp guy. He comes across as a buffoon. He comes across as an idiot, like an uneducated person who made this. Like it could have been directed like by anybody in the studio hack system. And this is a dude that loves cinema. He's passionate about cinema. And I don't get that vibe when I'm watching it, right? Say what you will about Guillermo del Toro. I was angry with how glossy his film looked. But when you look at the texture of the set, when you look at the costuming, it's clear that guy fucking loves the movies. I feel like Edgar Wright lost that in this movie. I felt like he was willing to just take the check, put his name on it. He's like, we've got Glenn Powell, we've got a Stephen King adaptation. I'm going to do it. It looked way too much like The Hunger Games, which I thought looked disgusting. Even when I saw it as a teenager, I was like, God, it's too glossy. It's too fake. It does seem like the Netflixification of the entire box office blockbuster thing is one, being rejected because, as you mentioned, this film is not doing well, and you can tell the studio didn't have a lot of faith in it because you can rent it to watch it today, the day that it was actually coming out. Yeah, I was shocked by that too. But let me go ahead and share this because
what? You can already watch it online?
I'm pretty sure you can rent it for $25. If you zoom in right here, we can watch it on YouTube from 24. Oh, it's a pre-order. Okay, my bad. I was like, crazy.
There's no way.
Okay, no,
I think there's literally a law that prevents studios from doing that. Like they have some agreement with the theaters where like at least there's a 2-week window. But yeah, no, that's funny though.
Okay, I saw that there and I was like, they must think this is going to flop. They must think this is going to be a disaster. And some films do better when you release them early. Like apparently that movie Good Fortune by Aziz Ansari got a nice little bump when it was first put on for streaming. But when a film like The Running Man comes out, like you guys should see it. If you're going to see it on like IMAX or XD, that would be the one thing I would note. And the other positive note that I would give is I think Michael Cera steals the show in this movie. I think his appearance is one of the best. It does feel like a direct ripoff of Home Alone in a sense, but I did like it anyway.
Yeah, I do agree with that. I think that Michael Cera does steal the show, much like in the Phoenician Scheme. He pops up for a short amount of time, but he totally steals the show and is arguably the best thing about the movie. But yeah, I mean, I think that this movie, you said to see it in theaters, but to me, honestly, you could wait to stream it. To me, it feels like a glorified streaming movie. I think it feels like a fucking episode of Black Mirror, like barely more impressive from a cinematic perspective than an episode of Black Mirror, which this film also fucking massively rips off. If you guys have seen that episode featuring Daniel Kaluuya, you know what I'm talking about. So yeah, I mean, if you really want the full experience, see it on a big screen. Obviously, that goes with any film, but I would say that you can 100% wait to see this at home. Watch it for as little money as you can if you really want to at all, because yeah, it basically does just feel like an AI generated mishmash of other better science fiction stories from the last 20 or so years. And again, I know part of that is unavoidable because of the fact that so many science fiction stories like The Hunger Games have taken inspiration from the source material that this film is based on. I get that. This book was written before The Hunger Games was, and they just, got around to making this adaptation later, even though there's already also the one with Arnold. But again, that's still on the director. You need to make the film seem different enough. You need to differentiate it, even if it's just in a visual way. And this film can't do that. Every single visual set piece feels like a ripoff of something else. In the second half of the film, there's a whole section of the movie that feels like a ripoff randomly of the movie Air Force One with Harrison Ford. There's tons of flashes of like V for Vendetta, like I said, Black Mirror, The Purge, The Hunger Games. It just feels like, oh, I've seen this before. You feel like deja vu in movie form when watching this film, in my opinion. And again, it never really escapes that feeling. You're just constantly like, oh yeah, I've seen that before, but done better and less cheap.
Which is a scourge on Hollywood, by the way.
Oh, 100%. It's a huge scourge. And honestly, it's one of the worst things about having seen as many movies as people like Zach and I have seen is because it's almost impossible to just go to a goddamn movie like The Running Man without seeing every
It's
single
like an
one of its
assembly plant.
inspirations. Yeah, just a total pastiche of inspirations, which can work. I think it has worked for Edgar Wright, as
Right.
you mentioned, with films like Shaun of the Dead. There is a certain style that lends itself to that kind of pastiche shit. And Edgar Wright obviously comes from the same tradition of filmmaking as like Quentin Tarantino, who wears his inspirations on his sleeves. You're obviously going to watch a Tarantino movie and see all of the things he's referencing and being influenced by. But when that works, it has to come together to create something that's more than just the sum of its influences, right? And this film never really does that. Again, it just feels kind of like a cheap streaming movie that's inspired by a bunch of stuff that's a lot better and a lot more worth your time. And ultimately, that's the way I felt about it. Again, I know we've been super hard on it. It's not a terrible movie. You're not going to hate yourself while watching it. It's perfectly fun. But I think we're holding it to a higher standard because of what we know Edgar Wright is capable of, not just with Shaun of the Dead, but I think we're both in agreement that Scott Pilgrim versus the World is probably his best film.
That's my favorite film of his for sure. I would put Shaun of the Dead as a follow up to that. But I personally, I would probably put Baby Driver as a number 2. But I would concede that Shaun of the Dead is probably his second most successful film.
Fair enough. But I think that, something like Scott Pilgrim versus the World, it's a great example of it. Has a lot of pastiche references to pop culture, video game culture, comics, movies, all this stuff kind of folded into something that does become more than the sum of its parts. It is a original and unique expression, really the manifestation of what Edgar Wright's filmmaking style is. But again, it still feels fresh. It feels original. It feels unique. It doesn't just feel like a pale imitation of better things. And honestly, that film, in my opinion, has probably become the number one defining cult classic of our generation. Like, I look back on movies that came out 15 years ago. When I think about cult classics, like what could be considered a Rocky Horror style movie of our time, it's fucking Scott Pilgrim. They literally have quote along screenings where people go and say every quote back to the movie as it's repeated, right? So Edgar Wright is capable of so much, and he's capable of making stuff that's more weird and has a lot more personality. And that's exactly what The Running Man needed if it was going to be successfully adapted in 2025, in my opinion, given just how much stuff has clearly ripped this thing off.
Yeah. Final rebuttal, and I'll make my case for why I think you guys should see it in the theater if you're going to, because I would have not made it to the end if I hadn't seen it at the movie theater. But I did find myself, it's kind of like one of those things where you're like dealing with circumstance. When I'm at the airport, I handle boredom differently than when I'm bored and I'm in my living room, right? Where depending on my circumstance that I found myself in, my reaction is going to be different. I probably would be coming out here like bitching up a storm if I hadn't seen this thing on the big screen. I would be ripping it apart because I would have been way more focused on the things that it did wrong, the cheapness. And when I see a movie on the IMAX, or we have an XD screen, which is like the ghetto version in our block because we don't have an IMAX screen that's really easy for us to get to. But I like it probably even more than going to the AMC. I just call it ghetto to be self-deprecating. Long story short, we saw it on a massive screen, very loud sound, okay? And the magic of the movies just hits me differently when that's happening. Same thing with The Longest Walk. I've made a real effort. Gavin's always been a good go see it at the movie theater guy. This last year, where I've had a lot more freedom and free time because we've been doing the show, and I can just be like, oh, we'll do the show 10 and then I'll go to the show there. And I'm not like at the bar for like 11 or 12 hours every day. It makes it fucking hard to schedule going and spending 2.5 hours somewhere. And I'm just like, wow, I am way softer on a film if I see it in the theaters. If I go and watch this thing on a big screen with the loud sound and a fucking Coke Zero, maybe I have a couple of Butterfinger bites while I'm watching it. I'm like, that buys it a half star, maybe a full star. And if I didn't have that, then I don't know if I would be able to, even recommend this film to you guys. But if you do have the ability to go see a relatively cheap showing, you like to get out of the house, you're a big fan of Glenn Powell, and you can see it on a ginormous fucking screen, then I would say you'd be like, yeah, it wasn't the best, but it was worth getting out of the house.
For sure. And I recommend everyone go see every movie in theaters, regardless of our opinion, because it's important to support the theater industry. It's important to support the movie industry if you care about movies. So yeah, for sure. In that sense, I totally agree. If you're going to watch this movie, you should support the theater industry. And if say this movie had come out smack dab in the middle of February, I would be like, definitely go see this in the movie theater. But there's like fucking 13, 14 other great movies that are already also in theaters right now that I do believe deserve your priority over The Running Man, which again, in my opinion, you can probably wait till streaming if you want to watch it. But yeah, go support the theater industry. If you are a fan of Edgar Wright, obviously it is worth seeing. I know we were super brutal on this movie. Ultimately, I'd probably give it a 5 out of 10. You know, it's nothing terrible. It's not offensive. It's not the worst movie I've seen this year, not even close. But it was a big disappointment. I'd definitely say it was in the top 3 biggest disappointments of the year for me so far. I know at some point we're going to release a full list of our biggest disappointments because there have been a couple. This definitely this definitely ranks up there for me because I am a big fan of Edgar Wright. I've come to expect a certain level of quality from him. And again, specifically stylistically, even when it comes to a film like Last Night in Soho, not a big fan of it. But when it comes to the style and aesthetic of that movie, it's on point. There's nothing cheap about it. It has some of his most rich and well thought out production design and cinematography. Again, this just felt very phoned in to me. Again, it's not terrible, but if you put it up against the best of Edgar Wright, even his action fare like Baby Driver, it's pretty pathetic as far as the cinematography, the ambitiousness of the choreography. It's all just very phoned in my opinion. So yeah, I'm being a little bit more brutal on this one than I would be if it was from a lesser filmmaker. But this is easily the worst Edgar Wright film I've ever seen.
Yeah, I also ranked it at the bottom, right below The World's End. Which isn't a bad movie. I actually prefer it. I haven't seen it in a while, but I think probably tremendously for all the reasons that you listed. It is an Edgar Wright film. It actually feels like the creative brainchild of an artist, of a guy who loves the movies, of a guy who's really connected to London, England, and who loves his roots there. All those kinds of things are missing from The Running Man. I might be slightly softer on Gavin. Again, I really enjoyed going to the movies, and we saw it on a big screen. So I would give it 6 out of 10, a full 3 stars. But I would 100% fess to the fact that it would be probably a full star lower if I hadn't gotten that immersive sequencing. Yeah, none of the texture, none of the I don't know, artistry, Riz, yeah, all of that. It was a real letdown, and I was an ardent defender. Gavin and I went round and round about Last Night in Soho. I really liked the chaotic ending. I could really stir up some controversy right now, make Gavin stay on the stream for another 30 minutes by saying, Derek, go.
Let's go.
Derek had a Mulholland Drive moment at the end where the world collapsed, and the nightmare of the show business really started to cement itself.
That's what Edgar Wright was thinking.
No, I know for a fact. I know for a fact that's what Edgar Wright was telling himself when he made. I liked it more than Gavin, but there's no way he thought he was a fucking genius. He was like, "This is so Lynchian, bro."